Thank you all for getting up early to join us for this session on harmonizing adaptable business integrity standards to advance business integrity. We are very excited to have an opportunity to speak about the general principles for business integrity that were issued by the multilateral development banks last year. We developed these standards among the MDBs in order to harmonize how we were looking at integrity compliance programs, primarily in the context of our respective administrative sanction systems, which John will talk about in a bit. So that's just setting the stage, and now I'd like to introduce our panelists. Oh, and I guess myself. So I am Lisa Miller. I head the Integrity Compliance Office at the World Bank Group. Next to me is Anale Nube, who is the Chief Integrity Officer at the African Development Bank, and she is based in Cote d'Ivoire. Next to her, we have Abigail Ofe Kwanzaa. She is the Chief Compliance Officer of the Jospin Group, and that is a group of companies operating in various sectors, such as waste management, logistics, information and communications technology, and she is based in Ghana. Next to her is John Fersant-Wart. He is the head of the Office of Anti-Corruption and Integrity at the Asian Development Bank, headquartered in the Philippines. Then we have Anu Portinan, who is the Senior Investigation and Exclusion Officer at the European Investment Bank in Luxembourg. And then finally, last but not least, we have Edward Steno, who is the Director of Compliance at Andrade Gutierrez Engineering, which is a construction and engineering multinational that is based in Brazil. And so we put together this panel so that we could offer some diverse perspectives. As I noted, the harmonized general principles were developed by the MDBs primarily for their use in reviewing companies' integrity compliance programs. But the intent was for these standards to be useful for companies in all contexts. So companies looking to develop and implement their own integrity compliance programs. Not just companies that are doing business with the World Bank Group or other multinational development banks, or MDBs, but to really make a set of standards that can be applied by companies operating with MDBs, doing private business, doing business with public entities, and the principles that could be adapted to all contexts. So while the principles that we look at in our context and that we hope companies will implement in their own compliance systems are universal, they really need to be tailored to each company's own context and its operating environment. Large companies will adapt these standards in a different way than small, medium-sized companies will. State-owned enterprises have unique considerations, so they will need to adapt the principles to fit their circumstances. Companies operating in fragile and conflict-affected states may have to do some adjustments just to reflect the reality of their operating environments. And so these standards were developed with all of that in mind, and not just different sizes and types of companies and different operating environments, but different sectors. So again, we have, one of the principles talks about due diligence on business partners. Construction companies might focus more on how they're going to vet their subcontractors, whereas pharmaceutical companies might focus that same principle on distributors. So again, common principles, common themes, but adapted to the company's particular circumstances. And so we wanted to get a perspective not just from the MDBs, but also from private sector companies, with Abigail and with Eduardo, to give their views on how these types of common standards can be beneficial to companies operating with MDBs, outside of the MDB context, just in general, and how these principles can be adapted to enhance their own integrity compliance systems. And so with that, we're going to start with Annele, who is going to talk a bit about that adaptability of these principles. So Annele, would love to hear from you a bit about, how these principles can be adapted in specific contexts. We mentioned MNCs, small, medium-sized enterprises, state-owned enterprises, business sectors, fragile conflict-affected states, and perhaps you could also share some examples from your work as to how you've seen companies actually make those adaptations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here and to share with you experiences from the African Development Bank on how we implement the harmonized principles. And in order to do that, I just want to quickly just share with you the profile of the companies that are in our portfolio, because we have several different factors. The first section is that which we call the micro and small, medium enterprises. Micro in our portfolio comprises of even like one person company, sometimes two, or just sometimes a very small family-owned enterprise in our portfolio. Whereas the small, medium enterprises are just the normal small, medium enterprises, which takes the normal small enterprises, which we all know internationally. Then we have the multinational corporations, which operate across different jurisdictions and therefore different legal requirements, different culture, different environments, and different challenges, of course. And then we have state-operated, state-owned enterprises. Those ones are much easier to deal with. As I discuss, we will see why. Now, back to the focusing on the big question. Are these harmonized principles adaptable? Yes, and we've done that in our experience. When it comes to the micro and small, medium enterprises, our experience has been that once these companies have gone through sanctions and they're supposed to be implementing these harmonized principles in order to help them get out of the sanction, or even before the sanction, when companies are just trying to improve their environment of accountability and transparency, the biggest problem has always been we don't have resources. We don't know where to start. This is costly. And in order to help operationalize this and adapt it to the environment, what we've done, we've taken a deliberate decision to look at what is publicly available. And this will involve the OECD standards, the ones that we share with African Development Bank, the UN Global Compact Standards of Risk Assessment. They are available, and there is a checklist of what is it that these small companies can actually put in place in order to lighten the burden on them by taking what we call health checks. And that is basically the risk assessment in the harmonized principles. So for the those small enterprises and micro, we normally just call it a health check. And once you start to adapt it, to that implementation level, you actually realize that it is relatable and it is doable. The checklist is there, it's online. And what we do is that because businesses are different, the sectors are different, this checklist, we adapt it to the sector, we adapt it to the nature of the business. And therefore, it becomes so much easier and relatable to these enterprises that we deal with. I will move on now to the multinational corporations. What we have seen is that sometimes there's a difference, not sometimes, all the time, there's a difference because they operate through different jurisdictions. Obviously, the provisions are different. And therefore, for those that are in our portfolio, we want them to be able to adhere to the principles. What we do is that if they already have a risk assessment, the results of which we will help them to look at it and see whether of all the things that are required from the harmonized principles are covered. And if they are not covered, how do we then help them to cover those? It is through taking them through the process, taking them through what is required, and trying to make sure that what is already available, because with MNCs, they already have, robust risk departments or compliance departments, as opposed to the micro and small and medium enterprises. Then it is about harmonizing those, that in the environment that they will be operating in, that is in Africa, it is acceptable and it is within the standards. So for state-owned enterprises, our experience has been that those ones are much easier, because obviously they are, they are based on the laws of the countries in which they operate. And therefore, because the basis of how they are established is on law, it becomes much easier now to get those to adapt to the principles that they are expected to keep to or to adhere to. Now, just in 2022-2023, we had about 33 micro, small, medium enterprises. And these 33 companies were supposed to be undertaking their integrity compliance programs as a result of the sanctions that had been imposed on them. All the 33 companies that I'm talking about were in sub-Saharan Africa. So what we realized was that there was low uptake or zero uptake. And we took a deliberate decision that we are going to contact them and understand why there is this low uptake. And when we did, the feedback was, we are confused, we don't know what we are supposed to do, because we are afraid of the costs. So you see, it then gave us the space to take them through what is expected and the checklist that I spoke about. So out of those 33 who were saying that this is too much for us, we'd rather fold, we were able to help. As I'm speaking now, 10 are uptaking on the integrity compliance programs. And for us, this was a short testament of the adaptability of these harmonized principles. As a result of that, what we have now done, those 10 plus the other companies that had already taken on board the integrity compliance programs, we have done what we call a buddy system, where new enterprises are now being paired, or we suggest a pairing to these that have already undertaken the integrity compliance programs, to take them through the process. Now, to move the conversation further, I just want to take 2 more principles and just discuss how adaptable these have been in our experience. I've already spoken about the risk assessment. So the second one is on this principle that requires entities to have an integrity compliance function or department. Once the entities that we deal with have seen that, one of the things was, how do we have that function when we don't really have it in our budget or in our plans? So what we have done now is to actually help them look at their existing structures and see where integrity compliance or compliance function can be placed. And when we do that, we realize that within these entities that we have been dealing with, there has been capacity and potential to do so. It's a matter of knowing what it is that is required and how to take from the principles and put it in such a way that it will work for the entities themselves. So what we have done because we realize that when it comes to the compliance function, and because of the nature of its function and what is required from that function, there's the tone from the top that is very, very important, that is required in this compliance function, because it is going to be the engine of where everything, integrity, accountability, and transparency will be placed. So what we have done is that to help them to make sure that the integrity compliance is placed at a level where there is the requisite power and responsibility to ensure that all that is required to be done within the entity, it is done, and the powers that are vested in the integrity compliance are consummate to what is expected to be done. Now, when it comes to the micro, small, and medium enterprises that I spoke about earlier, there is that anxiety of how do I have a whole compliance function when I'm a two-man entity, or when I'm a five family-owned entity. What we have done is that in the levels that they would have, we would still now require that one of the functions for any one of them, or five, whether they are 5 people or 3 people, one of them should be a designated compliance person to make sure that the risks assessment that are expected to be done are done, and done periodically, to ensure that the responsibilities that the entities are expected to undertake are done, and done responsibly. So I will also now move to the other principle that I thought it would be important to highlight, that is the investigation and reporting. As you can imagine, my favorite micro, small, and medium enterprises would not have a fully functional investigation wing or department. What we have done with that is that to be a little bit creative and say that even if your numbers don't allow, you can have something creative like a dedicated email address for that. And in some instances where even, the email facilities are not that advanced, we suggest your rudimentary small box put somewhere in the company where if there is any complaint, one can just put it in on paper and just throw it in the box. Normally those boxes in some entities are suggestion boxes. Why not use them as boxes where you can also put those complaints so that they can be attended to. Now, in terms of reporting, we've also helped them to incorporate compliance reporting, especially for the micro, small, and medium enterprises. When they do their annual reports or quarterly reports, there's a section where we then help them to put the required compliance reporting periodically. Then we also have a special section, fragile and conflict states. We normally call them transition states in African Development Bank. We don't call them fragile. But what has been very important and needs to be highlighted is that everything in those situations and fragile situations is not normal. Beginning with situations where we have entities who are expected to be paying, you may want to call it facilitation payments, but these are not really facilitation payments, they are protection payments because of the environment that they are operating in. On a monthly basis, there will be those groups that will be coming, a designated person from those groups that are in power will be coming to collect the monthly payment. So what we have done, because in some cases you cannot even ask for a receipt. In the interest of security and protection, you cannot say no. So what we have done and agreed with them is that those type of payments should be recorded somewhere. It doesn't matter whether the acronym they will adopt will be facilitation or monthly payment or upkeep payment, whatever. But they have to be recorded because they are an important part of reporting. So those are some of the things that we have been able to adapt from the harmonized principles, taken them through the different categories and levels of enterprises that are in our portfolio. What we are now doing in terms of information sharing and making sure that we bring all other businesses into the fold is that on annual basis, we do have some workshop where we talk about integrity compliance. We bring together companies that have gone through the process, that are going through the process, and we invite those that are supposed to go through the process for exchange of information and, to also manage this fear that is normally associated with costs of doing integrity compliance. And in conclusion, I just want to reiterate that our environments are different. However, what we have seen is that the harmonized principles give us an opportunity to ensure that we help entities to have strong reputation, to have strong accountability, to have transparency, and to work on the anti-corruption agenda within the means and within the nature and location of where they are. Thank you very much, Lisa.
Thank you so much. It was very helpful to hear how the Africa Development Bank has really taken these standards and used them to assist companies, but again, in a way that is appropriate to each company's circumstance, hence the adaptability aspect of the principles. And I should say the principles, Anela had talked about some of the other standards that are out there. When you look at the harmonized principles, I don't think anyone's going to go, oh my goodness, I never thought of that. Because they're consistent with what's already out there in terms of other guidance, OECD, US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and other guidance. But they're just packaged in a way that we felt collectively was most appropriate, obviously for our operating environments and the companies that are doing business with the multilateral development banks, but also just more generally for companies just interested in integrity compliance in general. And all of it really just wraps up to what everyone in the room probably has heard. What is the intent of any integrity compliance program? It's really to do 4 things: to prevent misconduct from happening in the first place, to detect misconduct if you think it may have occurred, to investigate misconduct if you think it may have occurred, and to remediate misconduct if you found it to have occurred. And each of these principles tries to address one or more of those 4 overarching goals. And so with that, I'd like to turn to Abigail to get an understanding of how companies can actually use these principles to meet those goals in their own operations, but not just in their operations, through their supply chains. The companies with whom Abigail works in her corporate group have very extensive supply chains. And so, we wanted to explore a little bit how companies use these principles themselves, but also how they may assist the companies in flowing integrity requirements down throughout those supply chains. So Abigail, please.
Thank you, Lisa, for that. And thank you, Anneli. You've actually said some of the things I would have touched on. And taking from where you stopped, the integrity compliance program can be very expensive if you find yourself in it. And so it's very important that from the company's perspective that the resources that is needed to work on the compliance program is available. It can also be time-bound, and the availability of the consultants to help and assist companies is very limited also, which then increases the cost of coming out of any misconduct issue or a compliance program. Now, for us as Just One Group, Just One Group is a conglomerate. We operate in 14 sectors with over 60 companies. Having gone through the integrity compliance, it has really helped us in shaping our policies and procedures and how we do things in the company, considering the various sectors that we work in, and also considering the various regulators that we also work with. Now, what we had to do is, after going through the integrity compliance program, we had to sit back and ask ourselves, we have gone through it with a sector, how do we decentralize the entire program whilst having a centralized compliance function as a company? So what we did was we ensured that every sector had a team lead that would help in driving the compliance program from the cluster or the group level, because Jospon Group has 5 groups, subgroups under the Apex group, and each sector team lead has to drive it in accordance with the various sectors. The harmonized business integrity principles are very useful. One, it helps you to work on your policies and procedures. It helps you, it's more like, I see it as a reputational thing. Once you're able to go through the process and you come out successfully, I mean, your company is seen as a very compliant company across the global, across the global space. Thank you very much, Lisa. So for us as a company, tone at the top was very crucial for us. We had to let our executive chairman had to drive it from the very onset. And it was driven from his level all the way down to the various management members. We also ensured that we had a centralized compliance function. We had a centralized audit function to drive the process throughout the group in ensuring that we come out and we are seen as a very compliant company. Now, for a large company like ours, how has it assisted us? It has assisted in expand. We can see the growth in the group and in what we do since we implemented the integrity compliance program across the Jospon Group. You find companies are actually approaching us rather than us going to them. And we have also seen that internationally, we, as a company that has gone through the integrity compliance program, you are recognized. And that also helps in you getting investors to want to do business with you as a company. And so I would say that going through the program, it's a very, very important and useful tool for any company. Yes, there might be an initial negative impact on your brand, but once you're able to go through the process and you come out successfully within the time frame, the sky is the limit for you as a company, and you definitely see the growth in your bottom line as you go on with your business. Thank you.
Thank you, Abigail. So that's a ringing endorsement for companies that have found themselves at the unfortunate end of a multilateral development bank sanctions process, that have conditions imposed for their release from the sanction that came out of that process, but that comes out really a stronger company. And we have some great examples. And Annalee talked about the buddy system that they use at African Development Bank. We at the World Bank Group call it a mentorship program, where we similarly ask entities that have been sanctioned by the World Bank Group, have met their conditions for release from that sanction and been released, so meaning that they've put in place enhanced integrity compliance measures that reflect the general principles. Those companies then voluntarily come back as mentors to small, medium enterprises that are sanctioned and working with our office to meet those release conditions. And I do think that tells a really good story about how having these common principles can benefit companies of all sizes, and how companies can come out stronger from what really is an unfortunate situation. And so with that, we're going to take it back to the MDB context, and John's going to talk a bit about the use of the general principles to address compliance failures that have led to the debarment or conditional non-debarment of entities executing contracts in the Asian Development Bank's operations. So, John.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everyone. Lisa set out the 4 main purposes of business integrity programs, being prevention, detection, investigation, and then remediation. And what I would like to talk about briefly with you is about the remediation aspect and how we use the general principles to effectively protect ADB resources. And similar to many of the other MDBs, I think it's good to bear in mind why this is such a big issue for us. Asian Development Bank, like the other multilateral development banks, are public institutions, and we have a mandate originally to fight poverty, but with the challenges of society nowadays, we've moved to more public goods, such as climate change mitigation, adaptation, fighting the pandemic, etc. We finance sovereign operations as well as non-sovereign operations. And last year, the bank was involved in infrastructure projects in the transport sector, energy sector, social sectors such as education and health, to the tune of $23 billion of our own resources, $16 billion of co-financing resources that we bring in. And this is going to be increased by $10 billion a year over the next decade. So we're talking about $50 billion a year from ADB alone. Together with the other MDBs, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of public funds in quite vulnerable regions, if I can say. Now, for this reason, it is for us critically important to have a very strong anti-corruption and integrity program in the operations that we finance. And the multilateral development banks from mid-2000s onwards have really collaborated very deliberately to have uniform approaches with respect to anti-corruption and integrity in our operations. And one of the key outcomes of that collaboration has been the cross-debarment agreement, and related thereto the uniform principles for how we investigate fraud and corruption allegations on our projects. Now, part of that whole framework is that we have sort of a baseline sanction that we apply when there's a finding of fraud or corruption on our projects. The baseline is a 3-year debarment where the entity or the individual concerned cannot participate in the operation, or sorry, in projects that the MDB is financing. And as part of the cross-debarment agreement, debarments made by one institution can be and often will be recognized and enforced by the other institutions. So it just has a very strong general deterrent effect. When we decide a sanction, we look at, we take the 3-year baseline, but then we look at mitigating or aggravating factors, which can be the severity of the misconduct, the harm that was caused by the misconduct. But one key element that we also look at is, and that can be an aggravating or a mitigating factor, is what actually was the integrity compliance culture and program of the entity concerned and that engaged in this misconduct. And if it's strong and we're more dealing with rogue employees or the sloppiness that caused the misconduct, that could be a mitigating factor. If we see that there is a general absence of an integrity culture, that there has been recidivism, etc., that really will count against the entity. Now, for us, being a development bank, it's very important that we are not only seen to be taking out the bad apples, but also to influence positive change in the region that we work in. Some of these entities engage in this kind of misconduct because they don't have actually the awareness of the importance of having this kind of integrity compliance programs. So we make it a point that when we do a debarment, it's always going to be a time-bound debarment, but you're not automatically reinstated. You do not automatically become eligible to participate in ADB-financed or the other MDB-financed projects. What we need to see is that there is an integrity compliance program, and more specifically, we want to see that the misconduct that was detected in the case at hand has been through tweaks or changes to the integrity compliance program will be prevented in the future. We do this for the barred entities, but we might also impose this, for instance, in those situations where we do not impose a debarment, but a conditional non-debarment, where somebody is given an opportunity to remediate within 2-3 years, and then if they show to our satisfaction that they have taken the steps to remediate, then they will avoid debarment altogether. When an entity is applying for reinstatement, we want to see evidence that they have now a robust business integrity program, and the general principles that we have developed as an MDB community are a very good reference tool. And as Anel also said, it is not a one-size-fits-all. It's really going to have to be tailored to the sector, to the size of the entity, and in our case, when it comes to reinstatement, we really also look at what is the misconduct that we detected and how has the entity taken steps that will avoid similar misconduct from occurring again. In case of group companies, we require that the integrity compliance program is applied group-wide, that resources are made available so that it's actually effective, that there's compulsory training for all personnel, and the program has to be risk-based. So if it's an entity that deals a lot with government, that is exposed to politically exposed persons or deals with politically exposed persons, that program needs to be tailored to those situations. It has to be applicable to personnel, but also to partners, agents, subcontractors, etc. This has been something that ADB has been doing from 2015 onwards. Before that, I think it was easier to get reinstated. We didn't have such a formal requirement around it. And in the last 10 years, we have debarred more than 380 firms, sanctioned 380 firms. And in 109 of those cases, it was a debarment or a conditional non-debarment that required a business integrity program in order to be released from the debarment or the conditional non-debarment. Contrary to World Bank, we actually do not ourselves verify whether the business integrity program meets our standards. We actually required a firm to engage a monitor. That monitor, the terms of reference and the scope of what that monitor looks at has to be approved by Asian Development Bank, and the reporting also has to be done to Asian Development Bank. And generally, these are reputable law firms or accounting firms that have good skills in this area and have an interest in maintaining a good reputation for certification. So we trust their judgment, and this has worked well for us so far. Let me stop there.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so since John called out the World Bank Group, we indeed do review the integrity compliance programs of sanctioned entities ourselves. We are the only MDB currently that has a standalone integrity compliance office, the office in which I sit. And we do sometimes require companies to retain monitors or compliance experts, but rather than relying on a certification from that monitor or expert as to the adequacy of an entity's compliance program, we consider it as one input in our verification process. So we do differ there from as John said, Asian Development Bank and others. And also, for those of you familiar with the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, process of monitorships. Similarly, they rely on a certification by a monitor in many cases. So we differ in that context as well. But at the end of the day, it is all based on these common principles. And John had used the word awareness raising, and I think that's really important. When we were discussing among the MDB community possibly developing these common standards and principles, that was a big part of the conversation. It was awareness raising, really broadening the platform, that utilizing the platform that we have to broaden the awareness of integrity principles. The World Bank Group, for just a little over 10 years now, has had its own integrity compliance guidelines, and those principles are reflected in the harmonized general principles that we're presenting today. But we now have the benefit of 10 years of experience, not just of the World Bank Group, but of the other multilateral development banks. And so we took that collective experience to really expand upon the World Bank integrity compliance guideline principles, and we addressed some nuances, and we reflected some of the principles with, I would say, a bit more precision. One example of that, the World Bank Group Integrity Compliance Guidelines, which still are utilized by us as well. But we talk about due diligence. So like due diligence of business partners, due diligence of employees. And of course, as part of the due diligence, we consider conflict of interest. And we would ask companies, so how do you check for potential conflicts of interest? But we didn't specify conflict of interest as a standalone principle. So we've had this opportunity, again, to use this experience of all of us collectively to get that precision built into the principles, and hopefully to make them more helpful and to increase awareness among the potential users of those principles. So now I'd like to ask Anu to talk a bit about how the EIB utilizes these principles in its own sanctions process called the exclusion procedure at EIB, and also in the settlement context, which is other MDBs also can settle sanctions proceedings via settlement agreements. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today. And I'm happy to continue the discussion from the MDB perspective. And I'd like to start by giving a very brief presentation of the EIB exclusion framework, and then explain how important the role of companies' integrity programs is, and then also to see how do these harmonized general principles then fit into all that. So obviously the EIB has a zero tolerance against fraud and corruption, which we call jointly prohibited conduct, different activities which are defined in more detail in our anti-fraud policy. And zero tolerance means that whenever there is a suspicion of prohibited conduct, it needs to be reported. If deemed relevant, it shall be investigated. And if it's then established that an individual or entity engaged in prohibited conduct, they should be sanctioned. And sanctioning in practice means that if we gather sufficient evidence, then after certain procedures, the management committee of the bank can, for example, make a decision that a certain entity is excluded from all EIB-financed activities and operations for a certain period of time. And there's two options to address such situations and such integrity violations, either through exclusion proceedings or through a settlement negotiation. And then in both options, this business integrity program plays a crucial role already when determining which option to choose. We first want to see whether the entity is actually already taking relevant measures to fight fraud and corruption. And of course, the existence of business integrity program is a good indication of that. And then, for example, if we have a situation where the entity, as soon as they became aware of the instance of prohibited conduct, they took relevant measures to mitigate it, and they show willingness to prevent similar incidents from happening in the future, then typically in such a situation, we might be willing to start settlement negotiations, compared to a situation where the entity has no integrity compliance program whatsoever and has not addressed the prohibited conduct at hand. So then we would be probably more interested in the exclusion proceedings options. And then, regardless of which options is chosen, the business integrity program also plays a crucial role when determining the actual sanction. Because if we can then see that, okay, relevant measures were taken, they are committed to enhance their integrity program constantly, then it can be considered as a mitigating factor, as John just explained. And then compared to a situation where they have like different attitude and are not interested to set up or enhance their compliance program, then it can be, or program exists, but it's not implemented or monitored at all. Then that could be seen as an aggravating factor, which would then again affect on the content of the sanction. And then third thing where integrity program is relevant is then the content of the exclusion decision or a settlement agreement, because it often happens, might even say that it typically happens, that the entities are then required to take additional measures to enhance the integrity in their programs as part of exclusion decision. For example, an entity may be excluded for a certain period of time, let's say 4 years, with conditional release after 2 years, provided that they set up or develop their integrity program, which is then typically monitored by an independent compliance monitor. Or it can be that we enter into a settlement agreement, and the sanction is conditional non-exclusion, meaning that the company remains eligible to participate, provided that they take certain measures to address the prohibited conduct which was behind the settlement agreement, and also in more general to constantly enhance their compliance program. And then to the actual harmonized general principles. So even though they were published relatively recently, a year ago or so, we've already noticed in our work that it's actually very useful guidance for at least for us. We haven't received that much feedback yet from the companies because there are long processes, as we all know. And it was very interesting to hear about companies' perspective. That, for example, if we, for example, if you take a look at the settlement agreements in which we've entered in, let's say, past 2-3 years. And so you can already see that the companies with which we've settled vary significantly when it comes to size or structure or operation environment, and then also the integrity risk profile. We've had small companies operating in a conflict-affected or otherwise fragile environment. We've had large companies in stable environments, multinational companies operating within the EU and outside the EU. And that is actually where the value and the beauty of the general principles lies, because they are key features that should and reasonably also can be incorporated into any compliance program. Like, for example, it was already mentioned the principle 1, risk assessment, which any entity can take as a starting point when setting up or developing their compliance program. And it's also useful for us when we start assessing entities' integrity program. We can take that as a starting point to see whether risk assessment was made. So, and then another principle like management role, which means that senior management should be responsible for creating and maintaining integrity culture, strong integrity culture in the company. And that is also something that it's possible for any entity. And good news for entities is that there are many measures available which are even free. And I personally think that it's one of the most important key principles, because if the tone at the top and the right mindset is not there, then it's very unlikely that the compliance program will be effective, regardless of whether there is an independent integrity function. And we've also already encountered similar situations, as Anel described, that there may be a small company with 2 or 3 persons. And it was very interesting to hear then how you've addressed that. But even in companies with 2 or 3 persons, they can have the right mindset, they can have the tone at the top, they can assess their risks, and that's where it all starts. So, indeed, and whenever we are engaging with the companies during settlement negotiations, I always emphasize that the main purpose of our exclusion framework is not to sanction and punish the companies, but to promote integrity. And I'm sure that most entities who want to participate in MDB financed projects share the same goal. And now finally we have one concrete tool. For example, then if we start settlement negotiations, the company wants to understand that, okay, what are you looking into when you're assessing our integrity program? Then we can share this publicly available document that these are the key features that we are looking into. So I think that's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've heard a lot about how companies use these principles in an adaptable manner, how multilateral development banks apply these principles in a tailored manner. And now we have Eduardo, who I've realized is really on the hot seat, because Eduardo is going to bring it all together. So another reason that the MDB has started discussing putting in place harmonized principles had to do with the fact that it does happen where companies find themselves in sanctions proceedings with more than one MDB. The company may have been alleged to have engaged in fraud and corruption under a World Bank Group finance project, but similarly, there may have been allegations of fraud and corruption in an African Development Bank project, and that company may end up being sanctioned by both of the MDBs separately. And then, as John mentioned, cross-debarred, which is always interesting because they're then both cross-debarred and debarred by the entities. But then there also are instances where companies may find themselves in sanctions proceedings with an MDB, but they also may find themselves under investigation by national authorities. And so, when we were discussing putting in place these principles, one of the intents was to assist companies who may find themselves in multiple MDB sanctions proceedings, to assist them in having a common set of principles to which they ultimately would be working in terms of enhancing their compliance programs to be released from those respective sanctions. But what we have found and what we have heard anecdotally is that having these common principles also can be beneficial to companies that are subject, and Abigail mentioned, and we're not let's not even talk about sanctioned companies, but companies that simply are operating in multiple jurisdictions and subject to multiple rules. But also they can be, anecdotally, we've heard that they can be helpful to companies that find themselves having to put in place enhanced integrity compliance measures, not just for MDBs, but also for national authorities. And as I mentioned earlier, the principles are what you would expect. They're what you have seen coming out of national authorities from other international organizations. The nomenclature might be a little different. Some say leadership, some say tone at the top, but they all wrap up to really getting at the same purpose. And so with Eduardo, and I got his permission, so I can say this, Andrade Gutierrez had found itself both before the Inter-American Development Bank in their sanctions and settlement process, and also involved in proceedings in Brazil. And so we'd like to hear from you, Eduardo, really your experience in putting in place an enhanced integrity compliance system subject to various jurisdictional requirements, and also how these types of harmonized principles can be helpful to companies, not just in that context, but just more broadly, as we asked Abigail, in terms of just your standard business, your decision-making processes, your management processes, your supply chain considerations. So it's a lot, but Eduardo, please. Thanks.
Yeah. Hello. Unfortunately, I have a lot of experience being monitored by someone, but anyway. So I'm very happy to be here, Lisa, with you and with my colleagues. I came from Brazil. and everybody know that Brazil is a very beautiful country, but we have a very difficult environment to work with, especially with public authorities. So I work in a company called Andrade Gutierrez Engineering Construction. We have been working in Brazil and abroad almost 75 years, and we have been conducted more than 1,000 projects around the world. I joined the company in 2011. I used to work for Deloitte, that was our external auditor in that time. And I was hired in a period that the company started to rebuild the corporate governance, rebuild the internal audit function it was my first area in the company. And then 3 years later, the company started to implement the compliance program. At that time in Brazil, we don't have experience in compliance program because we didn't have at that time an anti-corruption law even. So we start to look everything in the world, and the principles of MDB were very useful for us to put in place. But we lived a very, very strong moment when an operation of the prosecutors and the federal police, very famous in Brazil, called car wash operation. Everybody have already heard about it. The car wash operation was first in the oil gas company called Petrobras, and then it in another public company sector also. But as I mentioned, we started our compliance program before the car wash operation. And this was for us very useful, because when the car wash operation hit Andrade Gutierrez in the middle of 2015, we were with a lot of good practice ongoing. But for you to have an idea, before the scandal, the revenue of the company, it was 90% public, 90% public. And nowadays we have 80% private, in the private sector. So we changed the company a lot, because we think it will not be good talking to authorities, to public authorities, to try to make some lenience agreement, and in the other hand, work with public authorities. We thought it was not okay to do the same thing. So since the very beginning, we start to talk to Brazilian authorities first, and we signed our first lenience agreement in 2016 with the prosecutors. And when we agreed to pay a fine like $200 million in that time. And then we start signing some other lenience agreements, especially with the antitrust, but also with the federal controller. And in the end of this process, we also started talking to the IDB group, because we realized that we commit some mistakes in 2 IDB projects, and we stay maybe 6 months, 1 year talking to them. And in the lenience agreement of Brazil, we had an external monitor also. So we stayed 3 years being monitored by someone outside the company, and this monitor give to the IDB team reporting to say, oh, they are doing bad, they are going good, and something like this. And nowadays we are absolutely okay with even the IDB and the Brazilian authorities, but we suffer a lot, maybe 5 or 6 years being monitored by someone. Just to give you an idea, I took 4 principles of the MDB guidelines, just to give you an example of how we implemented. And the first one, it was the financial controls and audit. I used to be an internal audit, so my perspective is that the compliance officer should or must sleep well. So I started to develop an internal automatic audit process. So we use the SAP system, the German SAP. So all the SAP records we move to an audit software called ACL. It's a Canadian software. Then we have all these records, and then we start to do AI tests. So, for example, we test if a small company is receiving a huge amount of payment. If a company that only works for Andrade Gutierrez, it looks like strange. Or if a company that have just been created, why we are hiring a company that is just been created now? Or even a company connected to any politically special explosive person. So the system automatically look the payment or the purchase order or the contract and to start to criticizing. And then the internal audit function start to ask the executive evidence about this situation. The other interesting point is the decision-making process before the compliance program. Maybe the executive team, they have a lot of empowerment to do whatever he wants. And nowadays we have the board of directors with independent board members. And for you have an idea, before enter in new project or in a country or in a new client, the compliance team have to analyze even the most important vendors, and we do a compliance index about every stakeholders of this project, and the board of directors should approve this process. So with the compliance index of our client, of the country, and all the index, we send to the board of directors, and the board of directors will have to approve before the executive start talking about this situation. Another interesting point is that during the implementation of the SAP, we put some payment approval authority, like you have just $1,000, you have $5,000. But in specific situations, like consultants, like lawyers, like some service that are, that we used to make bad things in the past, we put a very strong approval authority that could be 5 people approving the same time, just to give you an idea. Other point, it's about the management roles. During this process, we changed a lot of people. You can imagine that the company used to be maybe 20 or 30,000 employees, because we do projects in the jungle, roads, stadiums, hydroelectric plants. But we change a lot of people in the senior management team, right? Because we really think that if a compliance is compliance, they cannot stay with people which commit any mistake. And everybody said about the high level, the tone at the top. Obviously, I really agree with this. But nowadays, I am more worried about the middle management compliance thinking, because the president, the CEO, the board are very, very far away from the operation. So in my industry, in the engineering industry, the director of that contract is more important than the CEO when we are talking about compliance. So we have 80 compliance champions that are in the project, giving them the compliance culture that we really want to implement it. And the last point that I select, it's training. And I think my colleagues from compliance, they commit a very interesting mistake when we are talking about training, because when we plan a training, you have to plan to the trainer, not to you. And the compliance people, they start thinking how the compliance function will be successful. No, you have to think about the other one. And we have a compliance survey every year that we ask the employees, how do you think about the compliance culture? What have been doing good and not good? And we hire some external auditors to see if everything is okay. We have a project in the Dominican Republic, and the external audit went there to see and to interview people, and they interviewed the employees, and the employees said that the word ethics and the word compliance, it was the first time that they heard it was inside our project. So I think big companies like my company, we have an obligation to, to develop an ethic environment where they work. So in the end, we really think we fixed the problem. I am sleeping well now, but anyway, in the end, we are not proud about everything that the company did in the past, but we are very proud about the new Andrade Gutierrez, yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Eduardo, you said something that made me think when we were talking about adaptability, and it had to do with the decision-making processes. So one of the principles has to do with decision-making processes and limits of authority, and you mentioned that as well. And in the company, you had said that for higher risk, I would say, business partners such as consultants, agents, of course, you might have a 5-person approval process. So for an SME, that might be, half their company. Mm-hmm. But, at least, we're a large company, it might be 5. Maybe in a small company, it used to be 1, but now it becomes 2. So again, it's just adapting. It's these principles can be adapted, and it's just getting people thinking about, gosh, maybe we shouldn't have one guy making all the decisions. So it really is just that was just one example that struck me where it really can show how these principles, the common thread is there, but then they're tailored in each context. So given the time, I think I'm not going to go on for other questions, to leave some time for questions, and if there are none, then we'll keep talking. But, just to kind of wrap up and link us back to really the anti-corruption focus of the conference. So what does this have to do with anti-corruption? And I think it has everything to do with anti-corruption, because, if a company doesn't have an integrity culture, or if a company doesn't operate under an integrity compliance system, there is a huge risk of things going wrong. Even if under the best program, things may go wrong. I mean, I don't want to pretend that any program is foolproof. It's not. I mean, people are still people. But at least having that structure in place, if something goes wrong, you might be able to detect it. You might be able to stop something before it starts. Or if it happens, you might be able to make it not as bad as it could have been, or at least you'll have mechanisms in place to investigate, to remediate it, to try to reduce the risk of it happening again. And so I think that it's so important for companies to be thinking about the role they have to play in putting in place these programs to really try to reduce their risks of falling under fraudulent acts or corrupt acts. And so, I just wanted to kind of loop it back to the theme of the conference and really encourage those of you in companies, those of you working with companies, to really think about how common principles can be implemented in your own context and how you can adapt those principles to put in place integrity compliance measures that are capable of implementation in your own context. Because it doesn't matter what the program looks like in paper. It really matters how you're implementing that and that you have something that's realistic. And I think we had examples of how companies have done that and how that can be done. And our hope is that with these principles, we'll maybe make it less scary for companies, especially the SMEs, to give them some encouragement that, gosh, we can do this. Maybe we can't do the 5-person decision committee, but we can have another person take a look at that. And that's a control. That's something that's enhanced how we're currently doing business, because it's not just that one guy in the corner office doing it all. And so, I really hope that the takeaway from this session might be that this can be done. It can be done by any company. And it really is important for companies to think about how they might incorporate these principles into their own operations and enhance their own operating systems. So with that, I would like to thank the panel very, very much, especially Eduardo, who traveled 27 hours just to get here. And so I'm extremely grateful to everyone, but I think he wins because that was a big ask. So thank you. And I do want to leave some time for questions, but I cannot give up the mic without a shameless pitch and advertisement. John and I both have some literature on a chair in the back. I hope you grab a flyer. John has brought the summary of the annual report from his team, and I have brought a flyer that includes a QR code, so it's very fancy, but it's a flyer that will link you to an integrity compliance platform that our team has developed under a generous grant from the Korean government. And it includes integrity compliance guidance tools. It includes resources in many languages. If you know of a resource in your native language and it is not on our website, please, please, please email me because we really want to have as complete a list of resources that we can. And there are also learning tools. So there is a learning program currently available on integrity compliance. You take the role of a CEO who's putting in place an integrity compliance at her company. That is already available. A second program is coming online hopefully by the end of the week, and that is focused on SMEs looking to put in place integrity compliance programs. And then there's a third module that's being developed by our prevention colleagues that should be available by the end of the month. And that is a learning tool that is aimed at public officials. And so it talks about, risk scenarios, mitigating risks that might arise in developing and implementing projects. So again, please feel free to grab a flyer. And with that, I would love to open for any questions that the audience may have. All right, well, because I know you, we'll go with Andrew. The mic's right there. Okay, thank you. Andrew from AIIB.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody, for the very enlightening session. I know most of you, but for everybody else, my name is Andrew Mendoza. I lead the integrity function at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in Beijing. We are harmonized with all the other MDBs as far as investigations and sanctions and cross-debarment, but we are going to be harmonizing this new document when we develop our own integrity compliance program in AIIB, because we are doing the same types of sanctions. Now, my question you've addressed in your last statement, at least part of it, on how we use this as a preventive tool for MDBs. But my other question is there a plan, an interest, or does it even make sense to use elements of the principles as a requirement for companies when they participate in our projects? Perhaps like a screening as part of the procurement review. Is that something that we should or could do going forward? Thank you.
Okay, I can speak to that. I have actually thought about this, and we're not there yet. The difficulty with that is that sometimes the assessment is a bit subjective, and the MDBs have always made a very big point of trying to make public procurement, well, a lot of it's what we do, as objective as possible, so there's no shenanigans in terms of favoring particular bidders. But thinking about having some kind of a certification as a requirement that would be sort of acceptable or seen to be objective is something that I think the MDBs might have to consider at some point.
I will just add, I think one of the concerns from our perspective has been the inclusivity. I think the concern is, especially for SMEs, a lot of SMEs may not have in place these types of programs to start, and we might be excluding an entire population by putting that type of requirement in place up front. But certainly there is some consideration around where we might go in that direction. But I think for now, for the reasons John said, and really the inclusivity aspect of how we conduct our procurements, it hasn't happened. Yeah. Thanks. No. Huh? No. Any other questions? I guess we go here. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you. My name is Rebecca Hack. I'm from KfW. For those of you not familiar, KfW is Germany's promotional and development bank. And I know you've said in your last statement that there is something coming out also addressing public officials. So I know my question goes a little bit beyond of what we've discussed on the panel, and thanks to all of you for sharing that experience. But since as the MDBs, I'm sure, as well as many other institutions like my company, we also work with sovereign states and players, and I think we can all share the understanding that having a high standard of integrity in the companies that participate in this project is only one element to the problem. And I wanted to inquire if there's any experiences in sharing these harmonized principles and any discussions about these principles also with the sovereign partners that you encounter in your projects, if there's even any interest by the partners, if there's any dialogue that you encourage on those topics in order to not only bring the companies but also their partners in those projects to the table. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. What we have discovered and what we are doing now is a conversation with anti-corruption agencies in the continent, taking them by regions and looking at how do we come up with tailor-made trainings or courses that will be placed in those anti-corruption academies in the regions, and with the hope that there will be an uptake not only by the private sector, but also by other players like project implementation units of different ministries that we deal with under the sovereign projects. So this is just a conversation starter. Nothing concrete has yet been done, but from what you are saying, I think it's something that we will also, put pressure on and see how it will turn out. But like Lisa had said earlier, one of the debilitating things or the things that have been really making us not to enforce enforce these principles before onboarding is because, as you may know, a lot of the micro and small and medium enterprises would obviously be pushed out of the, but they are the main sources or main players in the economy in our continent. Thank you.
John, do either of you want to add on this sovereign question?
Yeah, I wasn't sure about the question, whether your question is more aimed at what are we doing in order to make ourselves comfortable that the government that we're financing has the appropriate standards. That's the question, right? That's a very important question because we're, traditionally we're very much focused on the entities that are participating in our project, but there's also a demand side of corruption, and that's something that I think is somewhat a bit of an elephant in the room sometimes, because many of these governments are actually our own shareholders. But we need to be, we cannot stick our head in the sand on that, and we, as part of our operations due diligence, we do look at what the capacity is of the agencies that we're dealing with. We generally know if there are adverse news around them or if there's a bad track record with performance that indicates that we should monitor. We do not investigate government officials, but we can definitely, in our dialogue with government, tell when there's pockets where we're concerned about, and we need to do that. And but apart from that, in our own investigations, and when we see that there has been involvement of a public official, we will not. We might require the public official not to be involved in the projects anymore, but we cannot take any sanctions against that. We will have to refer that to the authorities.
Thank you. The gentleman next to Andrew, please. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. My name is Chris Kowalewski. I also work in the area of integrity management, and I have a follow-up question to what Mr. Longo Steiner was talking about with regard to the surveys that you conduct internally. And I was wondering, firstly, maybe the question to you would be like, what do you consider the cost of such an exercise is in relation to what it brings, you know, in terms of insight? And the other question would be, you know, in the realm of if evaluating effectiveness, you know, of the measures of compliance management systems. Is there something that you look into which has to do with this kind of soft indicators or compliance culture, etc.?
Yeah, no, the survey is absolutely simple. Actually, we have some questions regarding how the employee feels the compliance culture. It's totally agree or totally disagree. We have questions about the hotline. If the hotline they know the hotlines, the investigation is independent, and we just create a survey by an email sent to all the employees, and they will receive the answer. There is no specific cost. What cost for us is the external audit to make sure that everybody knows everything in terms of the compliance, because we have nowadays we are operating in Colombia, in Brazil, and also in Dominican Republic. So we have travel expenses, but it's not so big, no.
Okay, from my perspective, with regards to my organization, we have seen immense improvement in the compliance program. When we talk about the cost, we are involved in some activities. For example, if with the preventive side, for example, we conduct annual code of conduct trainings across the group. And we noticed that with regards to our whistleblowing line, there's a reduction in the number of cases that are reported year by year, year on year. We've seen a reduction in that. We've also seen that because the code of conduct training is conducted annually, and internal audit also visits the various subsidiaries annually, we have noticed that the misconduct has also reduced with regards to the number of investigations that we have to conduct. And when we convert that to what would have happened if we didn't have a compliance program, we're able to quantify the figure. So when we have to prepare our KPIs as a department, we are able to tabulate how much the company has saved from the compliance program. When it comes to evaluation of the system, our ethics line is managed by one of the big four. So on a quarterly basis, we receive reports. On an annual basis, we receive reports from the company, from the firm, on how we're performing. We see ourselves as the second line of defense. We believe that if the first line of defense, being management, are informed about what is expected of them with regards to their compliance initiatives, the second line of defense should be able to, if there's anything that is going to sieve down, we should be able to catch it. If we don't, then we have our internal audit, who are the third line of defense. We avail ourselves to investigation by the internal audit function. We don't profess that we know everything. Of course, who is watching the watchman? That is what we say to ourselves also. So we have our internal audit team who are also there to make sure that as a compliance function, we are doing the right thing. For every training that we conduct, there is a questionnaire. Thankfully, a questionnaire was developed for us during the integrity compliance program period with the World Bank. We are still utilizing this questionnaire annually, and when we analyze the data, we're able to tell that, okay, we need to start watching maybe conflict of interest issues are building up within the group, so we need to start monitoring. But the key thing is that as a company, you need to accept that there is a problem, and that problem needs to be resolved. And that can be resolved if we have an effective corporate compliance program. Thank you.
Thank you. There's the woman there. Yeah, thank you. And then why don't we take two? We can do her and then the gentleman right in front. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. My name is Claudia Zahn, and I work with a project that it's called Alliance for Integrity. And we talked a lot about access to the possibilities of bidding, also from SMEs, etc., part of the supply chain. And I wanted to ask about funding, especially looking towards the Siemens Integrity Fund that it's now running out also. We know that a lot of the activities that involve small and medium-sized companies are based on collective action. A lot of the standards that have been developed are based on collective action. Civil society is highly involved in developing these standards and also in monitoring. And I wanted to know, we talked also about remediation, if this is a plan to include these kind of fundings in the future inside these kind of remediation processes as well.
I'm not sure, because when you talk about funding, it's maybe a question. We don't fund integrity compliance programs ourselves. We request companies to self-fund. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, but I'm not talking about the necessity of self-funding of bigger companies, but also for exactly the smaller companies to be able to access. And in case you have, for example, settlement processes with bigger companies inside your processes, if this kind of funding could be included into the settlement, as it has been done by the Siemens Integrity Fund, to increase compliance capacities of small and medium-sized companies, especially in those countries where they build up the most part of the supply chain.
Got it. ADB does not have funding available for specific entities. We have a pretty robust capacity building program where we invite contracting community, consulting community, but also our own executing and implementing agencies to understand what the requirements are under our anti-corruption policy and our integrity standards, so that they know when they participate what it is that we need to see and what is the kind of conduct that they need to abstain from. But we don't have the kind of sort of financial assistance for them to build up their integrity compliance program. I don't know whether EIB has anything to say about that, or African Development Bank.
Yeah, so maybe I can start with the Siemens initiative. Indeed, 2013, EIB entered into a settlement agreement with Siemens, which also resulted to financing of this initiative, which is now coming to an end. But financial contributions are still, let's say, typical, but often part of our settlement agreements. It's only possible when it's settlement agreement. If it's exclusion decision, then we don't have that option. But in settlement agreements, we do have, and we are constantly using it. And the way it works is like with Siemens, that we agree with the company that they provide financial contribution to finance integrity projects, environmental projects, or social projects. And then it's up to the company to identify suitable project, propose it to the bank, and then we have sort of veto right. We either accept their proposal or we ask them to propose something else. And of course, we have certain criteria that the implementing party has to be completely independent of the EIB and of the company, so that neither of us can benefit in any way from this financial contribution. And then also the amount of financial contribution varies a lot depending on the violation, on the size of the company, and other circumstances, other parts of the sanctions. So it's sort of a balance, like longer period of exclusion, no financial contribution, or shorter period of exclusion and then financial contribution. So we are planning to continue that, so no worries. But then we have limited possibilities to actually affect on which NGOs then will get the financing, because companies need to propose them to us.
Thank you. And I believe that, the gentleman up there.
Hi, I'm Adam Turtletaub from the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics. We're an association for compliance and ethics officers. We've been involved in Brazil running training academies for 12 or 13 years now for compliance officers. And one of the things we've seen lately is compliance officers running into people complaining in business about over-compliance. Lava-jatos in the past at this point, many feel. And I guess my question is for you, Eduardo, and maybe also for you, Abigail, is how do you fight against backsliding after the resolutions happened, after the monitors left? How do you keep the emphasis on operating with integrity?
Yeah. The last meeting with our monitor, it was an interview with our CEO. And then the monitor asked this question. So the monitor ended, what's going to happen now? And then my CEO, it's a 76 boy, and he said, nothing. And then the monitor said, nothing? Yeah, I'm not working for you. I'm working for the society, for the company, for everything that we have been doing. And you said about the over-compliance, it was an expression very famous in Brazil, because we were in a period that Brazilian company, they don't do nothing in terms of compliance, and then nowadays they are doing or trying to do a lot of things. But in my perspective, it's a compliance officer fault. Because my colleagues start to think that they are the most important area of the company. My company is not a compliance company. It's an engineering in construction company with compliance. So I think the compliance function have to be aware that he is the oil of the integrity of a company, but it's not an integrity in the end, right? So I really think that our job in a company is to be, I don't know the word in English, invisible. Like the company have to work, and you just see in some important points. This is my perspective.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. For us, what we are currently still doing, we're doing it now, and we're still going to continue doing, is the training. We make sure that it's done annually, and we make sure that our management team, we segment the staff. We have a training for management, and then we have a training for the staff. Once in a while, we also do the same training for our suppliers, because we have centralized our procurement and supply chain for the entire group. So you can imagine having one department at the Apex Group responsible for procurement for the entire, all subsidiaries. We have also centralized our SAP system. We started with the Navision during the development period, but now we have moved to Oracle. No purchase goes out without going through the Oracle system. It's centralized, and everybody can see how you're performing, and that is being monitored to ensure that we don't have any other development issue. For any subsidiary that is going to go into a bid with any of the MDBs, my department, I am involved, because definitely they would have done a due diligence on the company, and they would have seen that one or two subsidiaries have been divided before. So there are some questions that definitely will be part of the submission of their application. So that comes to me, and then once it's completed, this is shared at an ExCom level. So at the ExCom level, everybody is aware, and everybody knows how much the process costs the entire company. And I don't think that we would want to find ourselves in such situation again, because that fund could be used to support other sectors of the group. With regards to your question on over-compliance, we have not really experienced that at the group level, mainly because even though we are centralized, for every group there's a compliance team lead. And also there is a compliance champion. And so before a compliance issue will get to an extent that we cannot work on it, it has already gone through the champion to the team lead. So by the time it gets to the apex, we are aware of what is going on. And also, as I said earlier, the retraining is something that is very famous. And if I do not send any staff to a subsidiary, they would call and find out, can you come and train my team on something like in the compliance policy, and then I'll send people over. Because of course, we cannot cover all the 60 companies at once. We have to do it in stages. So for us, we haven't had any issue with over-compliance, but with the backsliding side, this is what we do. Thank you.
Well, I know we're out of time, but I'm not able to take more questions, but please come up. If you have a question, please come up after. And I thank you all for your attention and for staying. And I'm just going to volunteer us all. If you want to come up and chat, please feel free to come up and chat. So thank you so much.